Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm Aliana Kernodle. A new bill meant to protect children was introduced by a representative from Texas called the National Educator Safety and Accountability Act of 2025. Joining me to tell us more about this is the Center Square's education reporter, Esther Wickham. Esther, can you dig into this bill a little bit? Tell us what it's about and the reasons behind it?
Yeah, thanks, Eliana. So, as you said before, Texas U.S. Representative Wesley Hunt, who is a Republican, brought this bill about over the past week. And essentially, this Accountability Act of 2025 aims to do a couple of different things, but the main objective is to protect and to prevent. Future sexual misconduct that we're seeing kind of rise within the education system. So this, legislative bill aims to, not only protect and prevent, future misconduct to happen, but also to respond to, educator sexual misconduct as we've seen kind of this rise. Essentially, this legislation would establish what is known as the National Educator Misconduct and Discipline Registry, which is essentially an online platform that would track sexual offenders and create kind of a task force for kind of tracking and understanding, what's going on. So that parents and school districts and states are aware of what's going on. And essentially, this has come about after we've seen multiple studies over the past decade, really, that currently 10% of children just within the US public school system experience some kind of sexual misconduct or grooming by school employees, by educators before graduating, which is just absolutely devastating. And this is only looking at US public schools. Right? This is not taking into consideration colleges, universities, private schools, charter schools. And so we don't want to even get into those numbers because I'm sure those are also shocking. But looking at the numbers and looking at the data, Hunt really wanted to enact change. And looking at the actual numbers of students, 10% is a lot, but what does that actually look like? Well, currently in the US public school system, there are roughly around 40 to 50 million kids in the public school system, which means that 10% of that is roughly between 5 and 9 million students. And so before these students are even graduating, before they turn 18, these horrible things are happening to them. And it's at the hands of those that, as parents, place these kids into protection and place these kids into institutions that they hope are there to educate and protect their kids. And the data and the statistics are showing that, these kids aren't really getting that. And so this kind of safety and accountability act wants to enact and wants to prevent future things from happening. And not only that, Eliana, Representative Hunt also wants to kind of hold these educators accountable. They want lifelong consequences, for these educators, potentially to restrict them from future educating opportunities. And what we've seen too in the data with these students is that these kinds of acts, these kinds of heinous, sexual acts against these young kids aren't just a one and done situation. The studies show that this kind of misconduct is going to impact them for the rest of their lives. It's going to have negative physical, impacts, psychological, and potentially academic outcomes. So it could potentially affect, their future careers, how they process certain things, who they actually become. And so I think this act that, Hunt really wants to emphasize is that they want to prevent, employees from just simply being dismissed, but actually have real consequences. In an email to the Center Square, Hunt kind of explained that, these kids should not be fearing adults. They are, there to teach and support these kids, and they should not be in a, anxiety driven, a fear driven environment. But they should be in a supportive educational environment. And so something he emphasized is that this kind of situation, even though it is super sad, it's just completely unacceptable. And it is the responsibility of lawmakers and of leaders to enact change and to ensure that their students are in a safe community. And this kind of online portal and this is kind of Educator Accountability Act is kind of one step in in the right direction.
Yeah, and I know I've heard stories before that oftentimes people will face their license being revoked or something like that in one state, but that information doesn't necessarily get transferred to other states because each state operates its education departments independently. So that makes sense why he would want to make this like a national registry. Um, what have people said about this bill? How have people responded?
Yeah, well, it only came out 5 days ago, so there is still, small increments of responses. I think a large majority, and as it should be, it is a bipartisan issue, this shouldn't be a political issue. But we're kind of waiting to hear back, to see what the left and the right kind of support in this. But the Center Square was able to have an email conversation with Arizona State Senator Janae Shamp, and she was able to, express her gratitude and praise for Representative Hunt and supporting, this bill. And, Senator Shamp has really in the past shown strong, support for protections in children against sexual predators. In Arizona, she has attempted to enact multiple bills to, keep kids safe. She's a nurse and a mom. And so I think for her, this definitely hits home. Uh, and something, she kind of described in her email is, this bill hopefully has the goal of ending what they call practicing, passing the trash. And what she means is by that is, when a horrible conduct or an act is done by an educator, they simply just kind of transfer that educator to another district or another area to kind of keep, the media down or keep things quiet. And so that's kind of her representation of this needs to stop. We have to have mandatory, federal regulation that keeps school employees, volunteers, contractors, in all school districts in all states across the country from just having secret settlements, right? We keep it hush hush, we keep it quiet, and we move on. And, she's in support of this because she wants to expose these, as she says, sexual deviants and potentially, she says, hold federal funding for districts that aren't going to comply. Because, again, just like Hunt said, and as Shamp has emphasized, they want to keep kids learning in a safe and fear-free environment, and they also want good teachers that have good intentions, and that those that are enacting these horrible misconducts against kids should not be hiding in plain sight. They should be exposed and everyone should know what's really going on. And so she thinks that, as a fighter for specifically the state of Arizona, that this act is super essential because it highlights not just for small local school districts or for one state, but on a national level. Because if one educator is moved, to another state far, far away, that information might not necessarily get out. And so she is definitely a strong supporter of it. And it'll be interesting to see potentially after the holiday season, how this will practically play out and, who supports it and potentially what are the opposition arguments for it.
Yeah, as you mentioned, the holiday season, everything kind of stops in DC. So we'll have to keep an eye on this when everyone's back at the Capitol and taking up this legislation further. Well, Esther, thank you for your insights on this story. You can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.